The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Martinez walked through the corridors of Naval Base San, her boots clicking against the polished floor with mechanical precision. At 28, she carried herself with the disciplined posture of someone who had learned early that visibility meant vulnerability. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation bun, not a strand out of place, and her uniform was pressed to perfection. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another dedicated petty officer going about her duties. But Sarah carried secrets that weighed heavier than any equipment she'd ever shouldered. The morning briefing room filled with the usual suspects, mostly men, mostly older, all carrying the easy confidence that came with rank and belonging. Sarah took her customary seat in the back corner, close enough to hear every word but far enough to avoid unwanted attention. She had perfected this balance over the past 3 years, becoming almost invisible while still performing her duties with excellence. Commander James Mitchell entered the room with his characteristic swagger, his uniform crisp and his smile too wide. Sarah's stomach clenched involuntarily, her hands tightening around the pen she held. She focused on her breathing, counting silently as she had learned to do during the worst moments. 1 breath in, hold for 4 counts, release for 8. It was a technique she had discovered online, designed for anxiety management, though she had never admitted to anyone that she needed such tools. "Good morning, everyone," Mitchell announced, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "We have several updates on the upcoming joint training exercises with the Marine Corps. I'll need team leaders to coordinate with their counterparts by Friday." As he spoke, his eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Sarah. The contact lasted only a second, but she felt it like a physical touch, unwelcome and loaded with implication. She looked down at her notepad, forcing herself to write even though her hand trembled slightly. The meeting continued for 45 minutes, covering logistics, personnel changes, and operational updates. Sarah absorbed every detail, her mind compartmentalizing the professional information while simultaneously monitoring Mitchell's position in the room. She had developed an almost supernatural awareness of his presence, a survival mechanism that had become second nature. When the briefing ended, most personnel filed out quickly, eager to begin their day's assignments. Sarah gathered her materials slowly, hopping to avoid the bottleneck at the door. She had learned that timing was everything. Too fast and she might draw attention, too slow and she risked being alone. "Petty Officer Martinez," Mitchell's voice cut through her careful planning. "A word, please." The room emptied around them, and Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest. She stood at attention, eyes forward, every muscle in her body rigid with forced composure. "Sir," she responded, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. Mitchell moved closer, ostensibly reviewing some papers on the table, but Sarah could feel the shift in energy. This was how it always began, professional pretense that would slowly erode into something else entirely. "Your performance reports have been exceptional," he said, his tone conversational. "Your attention to detail, your dedication to protocol, it hasn't gone unnoticed." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, maintaining her position. "I've been thinking about recommending you for additional responsibilities, perhaps some special assignments that would be beneficial to your career advancement." His voice dropped slightly, taking on an undertone that made her skin crawl. Sarah had heard these words before, had lived through the progression they represented. The promises of advancement, the subtle implications that her future depended on her cooperation, the gradual erosion of professional boundaries. She knew what came next, and she also knew that she would endure it in silence as she always had. "I appreciate your confidence in my abilities, sir," she managed to say. Mitchell smiled, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something predatory in his expression. "Why don't you come by my office later this afternoon? We can discuss these opportunities in more detail." It wasn't a request, despite being phrased as one. Sarah understood the language of power, the way orders could be disguised as suggestions when they came from someone who held her career in his hands. "Yes, sir, what time would be convenient?" 1600 hours, and Martinez." He paused, ensuring he had her full attention. "Let's keep this between us for now. Wouldn't want to create unnecessary expectations among your peers." The words hit her like a physical blow, though her expression never changed. This was the isolation tactic, the way he ensured her silence by making their interactions feel secretive and somehow shameful. She had fallen into this trap before, had learned too late that silence was both her protection and her prison. "Understood, sir." Dismissed. Sarah executed a perfect about-face and walked from the room, her pace measured and professional. But inside, her mind raced with the familiar cocktail of dread and resignation. She had approximately 6 hours to prepare herself mentally for what was coming, 6 hours to build the emotional walls that would allow her to endure whatever Mitchell had planned. The rest of her morning passed in a blur of routine tasks. She processed paperwork, attended a training session on new communications equipment, and grabbed a quick lunch in the mess hall. Throughout it all, she maintained the facade of normalcy that had become her greatest performance. Colleagues greeted her with casual friendliness, supervisors nodded approvingly at her work, and no one suspected the storm that raged beneath her composed exterior. During lunch, she sat with Petty Officer Lisa, one of the few other women in their unit. Lisa was everything Sarah sometimes wished she could be: outspoken, confident, seemingly immune to the subtle power games that plagued military hierarchies. They had never been close friends, but there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of shared challenges in their male-dominated environment. "You okay, Martinez?" Lisa asked, noting Sarah's unusual quietness. "You seem a little off today." Sarah forced a smile, the expression feeling foreign on her face. "Just tired, late night reviewing procedures for the upcoming inspection." It was a plausible excuse, the kind of dedication that was expected and admired in their environment. Lisa nodded sympathetically, launching into a complaint about the increased paperwork requirements that had been implemented recently. Sarah listened and responded appropriately, but part of her attention remained focused on the approaching afternoon appointment. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself moving through her duties with mechanical precision. She checked equipment inventories, updated training records, and responded to routine communications. Each task was completed flawlessly, but she felt disconnected from her actions, as if watching herself perform from a distance. At 1500 hours, she excused herself to use the restroom, needing a few minutes of privacy to center herself. The face that looked back at her from the mirror appeared calm and professional, giving no hint of the turmoil beneath the surface. She had become an expert at this deception, at presenting a version of herself that met everyone else's expectations while hiding the reality of her experience. The walk to Mitchell's office felt simultaneously endless and far too short. Sarah's training had taught her to control her breathing, to maintain perfect posture under stress, but nothing had prepared her for this particular kind of endurance test. She paused outside his door, straightening her uniform one final time before knocking. "Enter." Mitchell's office was larger than most, befitting his rank and position. The walls were decorated with commendations, photographs from various assignments, and the usual military memorabilia that spoke to a successful career. Sarah had been in this space before, had experienced its transformation from a professional environment into something else entirely. "Petty Officer Martinez, right on time. Please take a seat." She remained standing. "I prefer to stand, sir." "Of course." His smile suggested he found her formality amusing rather than appropriate. "I've been reviewing your file, and I'm impressed by your progression. 3 years of exemplary service, excellent fitness reports, glowing recommendations from your previous supervisors." Sarah waited, knowing that praise was often the prelude to a request for something in return. "I think you have real potential for advancement, but success in the Navy requires more than just technical competence. It requires understanding how relationships work, how trust is built, how loyalty is demonstrated." The words were carefully chosen, each one adding another layer to the web he was constructing around her. Sarah had heard similar speeches before, understood the subtext that lurked beneath the professional language. "I believe in demonstrating loyalty through excellent performance, sir." "Of course, that's important, but sometimes loyalty requires a more personal commitment, a willingness to go above and beyond what's written in the regulations." Mitchell moved closer as he spoke, closing the distance between them with casual confidence. Sarah felt her muscles tense, her body preparing for fight or flight. Even as her training demanded, she remained still and respectful. "I'm not sure I understand, sir." "I think you understand perfectly well." His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, and Sarah could smell his cologne, could see the calculation in his eyes. "The question is whether you're smart enough to recognize an opportunity when it's presented to you." This was the moment Sarah had dreaded, the point where pretense dropped away and the real purpose of their meeting became clear. She had choices, all of them terrible. She could report the incident, knowing that her word against his would likely result in her own career destruction. She could refuse and face the consequences of defying a superior officer. Or she could submit, as she had before, and preserve the fragile stability of her position while sacrificing pieces of herself she could never reclaim. Sir, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the purpose of this meeting. Mitchell laughed softly, a sound that held no warmth. There's no misunderstanding, petty officer. There's just a choice. You can be part of the team, or you can continue to struggle on your own. I know about your background, Martinez. I know how hard you've worked to get where you are, and I know how easily it could all disappear. The threat was implicit but clear. Sarah's file contained information about her difficult childhood, her struggle to afford college before enlisting, her lack of influential connections or family support. Mitchell was reminding her how vulnerable her position really was, how much she had to lose. Sarah's mind raced through her options, weighing consequences and probabilities with the analytical skills the Navy had sharpened in her. Every scenario led to the same conclusion. She was trapped in a system that would protect him and abandon her. The realization settled over her like a cold weight, familiar and inevitable. "I understand, sir," she said finally, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I thought you might." Mitchell's satisfaction was evident in his voice. "I knew you were intelligent. That's why I think we're going to work very well together." What followed was 45 minutes of Sarah's life that she would later struggle to remember clearly. Her mind had developed its own defense mechanisms, creating a kind of emotional distance that allowed her to endure while protecting her core sense of self. She focused on the clock on the wall, on the sound of voices in the hallway outside, on anything that could anchor her to reality while the situation played out around her. When it was over, Mitchell returned to his professional demeanor as if nothing had happened. He discussed the upcoming training exercises, provided her with some additional assignments, and dismissed her with casual efficiency. Sarah left his office with the same measured pace she had entered, though everything had changed. The remainder of her duty day passed in a haze of automated responses and mechanical performance. Sarah completed her tasks, filed her reports, and prepared for the next day's schedule with the same attention to detail she always demonstrated. But something fundamental had shifted inside her. Another piece of her authentic self had been locked away behind walls of necessity and survival. That evening, Sarah returned to her small apartment off base, a modest space that represented the independence she had worked so hard to achieve. She showered for a long time, letting the hot water wash over her as if it could cleanse more than just physical contact. She prepared a simple dinner that she barely tasted, checked her emails, and reviewed the next day's schedule. Before bed, she stood at her bathroom mirror, looking at the reflection of a woman who appeared unchanged by the day's events. Her face showed no signs of trauma. Her posture remained straight and confident. Her eyes betrayed nothing of the storm within. This was perhaps her greatest skill, the ability to compartmentalize, to function normally while carrying experiences that would have broken someone less resilient. As she lay in the darkness, Sarah allowed herself a few minutes to acknowledge what had happened, to feel the full weight of her situation without the protective numbness she wore during daylight hours. Tomorrow, she would return to work, would face Mitchell and others like him, would continue to perform her duties with excellence while navigating dangers that were never mentioned in any training manual. She thought about her younger self, the girl who had enlisted with such hope and determination, who had believed that excellence and dedication would be enough to earn respect and advancement. That girl seemed like a stranger now, her optimism weathered away by years of harsh reality. But even in the darkness, even with the full knowledge of what she faced, Sarah found the strength to begin planning for tomorrow. She would get up, she would put on her uniform, she would return to her duties. She would endure, as she always had, because the alternative was to lose everything she had worked to build. The next morning would bring new challenges, new tests of her ability to maintain the facade of normalcy while protecting what remained of her authentic self. But for now, in the quiet safety of her own space, Sarah allowed herself to exist without pretense, to acknowledge her pain without judgment, and to gather the strength she would need for whatever came next. 3 weeks had passed since that afternoon in Mitchell's office, and Sarah had fallen into a new rhythm of survival. The pattern had become depressingly familiar, professional meetings that gradually shifted into something else, assignments that required her presence during off hours, and a steady erosion of boundaries that she had once believed were protected by military protocol. She had become expert at reading the signs, understanding when Mitchell's summons were legitimate work-related matters and when they served his other purposes. The uncertainty was almost worse than the incidents themselves, keeping her in a constant state of hypervigilance that was exhausting to maintain. On this particular morning, Sarah arrived at work 30 minutes early, as had become her habit. The early arrival allowed her to complete preparations for the day before the building filled with personnel, reducing her interactions with Mitchell to the absolute minimum necessary for professional function. She had mapped out his schedule, learned his patterns, and developed strategies for avoiding unnecessary contact. The communications center was quiet at this hour, filled only with the soft hum of equipment and the occasional click of keyboards from the overnight shift preparing to hand off their duties. Sarah appreciated this peaceful interlude, using the time to center herself for whatever the day might bring. Petty Officer arrived shortly after Sarah, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the base coffee shop. She offered one to Sarah with a concerned expression that had become more frequent in recent weeks. "You look tired," observed, settling at the workstation next to Sarah's. "Are you sleeping okay?" Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. Sleep had become elusive lately, her mind too active with worry and planning to easily shut down at night. "Just busy," she replied, the standard deflection she had perfected. "The new protocols require more documentation than I expected." Studied her with the careful attention of someone who suspected there was more to the story. They had known each other for 2 years now, and despite Sarah's efforts to maintain professional distance, had proven persistent in her attempts at friendship. "You know, Martinez, if something was bothering you, you could talk to me about it. Sometimes it helps to have someone listen, even if they can't fix anything." The offer was genuine, filled with warmth that Sarah rarely encountered in their environment. For a moment, she was tempted to accept, to share some small piece of her burden with someone who might understand. But the risk was too great, the potential consequences too severe. "I appreciate that, really, but I'm handling things fine." Didn't look convinced, but she respected Sarah's boundaries enough not to push further. They worked in companionable silence for the next hour, focusing on equipment checks and message routing that would keep the base's communications running smoothly. At 0800 hours, the morning briefing began. Sarah took her usual position, notepad ready, mind prepared to absorb and process the day's information while simultaneously monitoring for threats. Mitchell entered precisely on time, his bearing confident and his manner suggesting nothing had changed in their professional relationship. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice carrying its usual authority. "Today we're beginning preparations for the joint exercise with Marine Force Reconnaissance. This will involve enhanced security protocols and extended operational hours for key personnel." As he outlined the requirements, Sarah felt a familiar sinking sensation in her stomach. Extended hours meant more opportunities for private meetings, more chances for the professional facade to slip into something else entirely. She made careful notes while her mind raced through potential strategies for managing the increased exposure. "Petty Officer Martinez," Mitchell's voice cut through her thoughts, "you'll be coordinating communications security for the exercise. Report to my office at 1400 hours for detailed briefing materials." The announcement was delivered with perfect professional neutrality, but Sarah caught the subtle satisfaction in his expression. He was using the exercise as cover, creating legitimate reasons for their interaction that would be impossible to question or avoid. "Yes, sir," she responded, her voice steady despite the dread pooling in her chest. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering logistics, personnel assignments, and timeline requirements. Sarah absorbed every detail while part of her mind calculated how many private meetings she would likely face over the coming weeks. The exercise was scheduled to last 10 days, with preparation time extending the period to nearly 3 weeks of elevated contact with Mitchell. After the briefing, Sarah returned to her workstation to begin preliminary preparations for the communications security role. The assignment was legitimate and important, requiring coordination with multiple agencies and careful attention to protocol. Under normal circumstances, she would have been excited by the responsibility and the opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities. Instead, she found herself focusing on damage control, planning how to navigate the increased interaction while protecting herself from further escalation. She had learned to compartmentalize her professional performance from her personal survival, but the exercise would test that ability like never before. Around midday, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her workstation. Lieutenant Commander approached with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command. Was the executive officer for their unit, a woman in her early 40s who had earned respect through competence and fair leadership. Sarah had always admired her from a distance, but had never had significant direct interaction with her. Petty Officer Martinez said, "Do you have a few minutes? I'd like to discuss the communications security assignment." Sarah stood immediately, recognizing both the authority and the opportunity in the request. "Of course, ma'am." "My office, please." His office was smaller than Mitchell's but more efficiently organized, reflecting her practical approach to leadership. The walls displayed her qualifications and commendations without ostentation, and her desk was neat but clearly well used. Sarah felt more comfortable here than she had in months, sensing an absence of the predatory undertones that had become her constant companion. "Please sit down," gestured to the chair across from her desk. "I wanted to discuss your role in the upcoming exercise, but also to check in with you generally. Your performance has been exceptional, but I've noticed some changes recently that concern me." Sarah's heart rate increased, but with anxiety rather than the fear she had grown accustomed to. His manner was direct but not threatening, professional without the undercurrents that made interaction with Mitchell so treacherous. "Ma'am, your work quality remains outstanding, but you seem more withdrawn than usual. You used to participate more actively in briefings, ask questions, offer suggestions. Lately, you've been very quiet." The observation was accurate and perceptive, highlighting changes that Sarah had hoped were less noticeable. She had indeed become more passive in group settings, finding it safer to blend into the background than risk drawing attention to herself. "I've been focusing more on execution than discussion, ma'am, making sure to absorb all information before responding." Studied her with intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than Sarah was comfortable revealing. "That's admirable, but initiative and engagement are also important qualities for advancement. I don't want to see you limiting your own potential." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, suggesting that recognized something was affecting Sarah's behavior, even if she couldn't identify the specific cause. Sarah felt a moment of dangerous hope, wondering if this conversation might lead somewhere that could help her situation. "I appreciate your concern, ma'am. I'll work on being more engaged." "Good," paused, then continued in a slightly different tone. "Martinez, you've been in the Navy for 3 years now. You've proven yourself capable and dedicated. But I also want you to know that if you ever face any challenges that affect your ability to perform or feel comfortable in your position, my door is always open." The invitation was carefully worded but unmistakably genuine. Sarah felt tears threaten for the first time in weeks, overwhelmed by the simple offer of support. But even as she appreciated the gesture, she knew the impossibility of accepting it. Might be sympathetic, but she was still part of the same system that would ultimately protect Mitchell's interests over Sarah's. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a great deal to me." "I mean it, Martinez. Sometimes we all need someone to listen, and sometimes problems that seem insurmountable have solutions we haven't considered." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The kindness in his voice was almost harder to bear than Mitchell's threats, reminding her of what normal professional relationships should feel like. "Now about the communications security assignment," continued, returning to business mode. "This is a significant responsibility, and I want to make sure you have all the support you need. Commander Mitchell will provide the technical briefings, but if you need additional resources or encounter any obstacles, come to me directly." The statement contained subtle layers of meaning that Sarah wasn't sure how to interpret. Was offering protection or simply ensuring mission success? Either way, the knowledge that she had an alternative reporting chain provided some small comfort. "Understood, ma'am." "Excellent. I'll be monitoring the exercise closely, so you'll be seeing more of me over the coming weeks. I want this to be a showcase for our unit's capabilities." Sarah left's office feeling simultaneously better and worse than she had in weeks. The conversation had reminded her that not everyone in the military operated like Mitchell, that there were still people who valued professionalism and integrity. But it had also highlighted just how isolated her situation had become, how far she had drifted from normal professional relationships. The afternoon appointment with Mitchell approached with inevitable certainty. Sarah spent the remaining time completing routine tasks while mentally preparing for whatever was coming. She had developed coping mechanisms for these encounters, ways of disconnecting her mind from her body that allowed her to endure while preserving some core part of herself. At precisely 1400 hours, she knocked on Mitchell's door, her expression professionally neutral and her posture perfect. "Enter." The office felt different this afternoon, more intimate somehow despite being the same space. Mitchell had drawn the blinds partially closed and positioned himself behind his desk in a way that created shadows across his face. Sarah remained standing near the door, maintaining maximum distance while still showing appropriate respect. "Petty Officer Martinez, thank you for being prompt. We have quite a bit to cover regarding the communications security protocols." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, but Sarah remained standing. This small act of resistance had become important to her, a way of maintaining some control over the situation even when she had none. "The exercise will require enhanced security measures," Mitchell continued, opening a folder on his desk. "Encrypted communications, secure channel management, coordinated frequency changes. It's complex work that will require close supervision." The words were professional, but Sarah could hear the subtext underneath. Close supervision meant private meetings, enhanced security provided cover for irregular schedules, and the complexity justified extended contact. "I understand the technical requirements, sir," Sarah said carefully. "I've reviewed the preliminary protocols and prepared implementation timelines." "Of course you have. Your thoroughness is one of the things I most appreciate about working with you." Mitchell's smile held implications that made Sarah's skin crawl. "But this assignment will require more than just technical competence. It will require trust, flexibility, and a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances." Each word added another layer to the trap he was constructing around her. Sarah understood that her professional success was being deliberately entangled with her personal submission, creating a web of coercion that would be impossible to escape without destroying her career. "I'm committed to mission success, sir." "I know you are. That's why I've been thinking about additional opportunities for you, ways to demonstrate your potential for advancement. Of course, such opportunities require discretion and a clear understanding of priorities." The conversation continued in this vein for nearly an hour, with Mitchell alternating between legitimate technical discussions and increasingly personal comments. Sarah responded appropriately to the professional content while deflecting or ignoring the personal intrusions as much as possible. When the meeting finally ended, Sarah felt drained in a way that had nothing to do with the technical complexity of her assignment. She had successfully navigated another encounter, but each one left her feeling more isolated and desperate for some kind of resolution. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment staring at her laptop screen, cursor blinking in an empty email composition window. She had started and deleted dozens of messages over the past weeks, reports to superior officers, requests for transfer, even anonymous complaints to various military oversight organizations. Each attempt had ended the same way, with the realization that any action she took would likely result in her own destruction. She thought about Lieutenant Commander's offer to listen, weighing the potential benefits against the enormous risks. Seemed genuinely concerned and appeared to be someone who valued integrity, but she was still part of a system that had consistently failed women in Sarah's situation. As the night deepened, Sarah made a decision that felt both necessary and dangerous. She would document everything that was happening, creating a detailed record of dates, times, and incidents that could serve as evidence if the situation ever reached a breaking point. She wouldn't act on the information immediately, but she would be prepared if the opportunity for justice ever presented itself. She began typing, her fingers moving slowly at first, then with increasing confidence as she found the words to describe experiences she had never shared with anyone. The document would be hidden, encrypted, and safely stored, waiting for the day when silence was no longer her only option for survival. The joint exercise had entered its second week, and Sarah's world had narrowed to a careful balance between professional excellence and personal survival. The increased operational tempo had provided Mitchell with countless opportunities for private meetings, equipment inspections that required her presence in isolated areas, and late-night briefings that served purposes far removed from military necessity. Sarah had documented everything in her encrypted files, building a chronological record that grew longer each day. The act of writing had become both therapeutic and empowering, giving her some sense of control over events that seemed determined to spiral beyond her influence. But even as she maintained this secret record, the daily reality of her situation continued to deteriorate. On this particular morning, Sarah arrived at the communications center to find unusual activity. Several personnel she didn't recognize were setting up additional equipment, and the normal workflow had been disrupted to accommodate new security protocols. The atmosphere hummed with the tension that always accompanied high-stakes military operations. Lieutenant Commander appeared at Sarah's workstation, moving with the focused energy that had earned her respect throughout the command. "Martinez, I need you to coordinate with the Marine liaison team that just arrived. They're setting up parallel communication channels for the final phase of the exercise." Sarah looked up from her console, noting the unusual intensity in his manner. "Ma'am, I wasn't informed about additional personnel joining the operation." Last-minute addition. Apparently, some important observers want real-time access to our communications security protocols. Consider it a compliment to your work. They specifically requested to observe our procedures. The information created a knot of anxiety in Sarah's stomach. More observers meant more scrutiny, which usually translated to additional pressure from Mitchell to ensure everything appeared perfectly professional. She had learned that high-visibility situations often led to increased private meetings, where he could emphasize the importance of discretion and cooperation. "Understood, ma'am. When do they need the initial briefing?" 14:30 hours. Conference room B. I'll be sitting in on this one. I want to make sure our unit makes the best possible impression. His presence at the meeting provided some comfort, suggesting that this would be a legitimately professional interaction. Sarah had begun to classify her daily activities based on the likelihood of problematic encounters, and its involvement moved this meeting into the relatively safe category. The morning passed quickly as Sarah prepared briefing materials and coordinated with various departments to ensure smooth integration of the new personnel. The work was complex and demanding, requiring the kind of focused attention that had always been her refuge from other concerns. At lunchtime, Sarah sat alone in a corner of the mess hall, reviewing her notes while eating a sandwich she barely tasted. She had grown accustomed to solitary meals, finding that social interaction required energy she couldn't spare while managing her other challenges. "Mind if I join you?" Sarah looked up to see a Marine captain she didn't recognize, a woman in her mid-30s with an air of quiet confidence. Her uniform was impeccable, her bearing suggesting someone accustomed to command responsibility. "Of course not, ma'am." The captain sat down across from Sarah, extending her hand. "Captain Santos, Force Reconnaissance Communications. I understand you're coordinating security protocols for our joint operation." "Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, ma'am. Yes, I'm handling the Navy side of the communications security." Santos studied Sarah with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in more than casual interest would suggest. "I've heard excellent things about your work from Lieutenant Commander. She speaks very highly of your technical skills and professionalism." The praise felt foreign after weeks of interactions that had nothing to do with her actual capabilities. Sarah found herself responding with more enthusiasm than she had shown in recent memory. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm looking forward to working with your team. Joint operations always present interesting coordination challenges." "Indeed they do. I've been reviewing the protocols you've developed, and I'm impressed by the attention to detail. You've anticipated several potential security vulnerabilities that my own team hadn't considered." As they talked, Sarah felt herself relaxing in a way that had become rare. Santos treated her as a professional equal, asking thoughtful questions about technical procedures and offering insights from her own experience. The conversation reminded Sarah of why she had originally loved her work, before other factors had complicated everything. "I understand you've been working closely with Commander Mitchell on this operation," Santos mentioned, her tone carefully neutral. Sarah's alertness immediately sharpened, wondering if this was somehow connected to Mitchell's influence, or if Santos had independent reasons for the question. Yes, ma'am. He's been providing oversight for the security protocols. Santos nodded thoughtfully. Mitchell has quite a reputation, very ambitious, very focused on advancement. I imagine working with him has been educational. Something in Santos's tone suggested layers of meaning beyond the surface words. Sarah found herself wondering if this Marine captain had heard rumors or if she was simply making conversation. He's certainly demanding of excellence, Sarah replied carefully. I'm sure he is. Santos paused, then continued in a slightly different tone. You know, Martinez, I've been in the military for 12 years now. I've seen a lot of different leadership styles, worked with all kinds of people. One thing I've learned is that truly professional relationships are built on mutual respect and clear boundaries. The statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Sarah wasn't sure how to interpret. Was Santos offering some kind of warning or simply sharing general wisdom? I agree, ma'am. Professional boundaries are important for maintaining good order and discipline. Exactly. And when those boundaries become unclear, it creates problems for everyone involved. Sometimes people in positions of authority forget that respect has to flow in both directions. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, wondering if this conversation was leading somewhere specific or if she was reading too much into Santos's words. I believe in maintaining appropriate professional relationships, she said carefully. Santos studied her for a moment longer, then seemed to make some internal decision. Martinez, I want you to know that if you ever need someone to talk to about challenges in your work environment, someone outside your direct chain of command, I'm available. Sometimes an outside perspective can be helpful. The offer was eerily similar to the one Lieutenant Commander had made, but coming from someone completely outside her unit, it carried different implications. Sarah felt a dangerous surge of hope, wondering if Santos somehow knew about her situation or was simply being generally supportive. I appreciate that, ma'am. Thank you. Good. Now let's talk about the technical integration for this afternoon's briefing. I want to make sure we're completely coordinated. They spent the remainder of lunch discussing legitimate operational details, but Sarah's mind kept returning to Santos's earlier comments about professional boundaries and leadership styles. For the first time in months, she felt like someone might have glimpsed her reality without requiring her to explicitly reveal it. The afternoon briefing was scheduled for 14:30 hours, and Sarah arrived early to set up presentation materials and test the audio-visual equipment. The conference room gradually filled with personnel from both services, creating a formal atmosphere that felt reassuringly professional. Lieutenant Commander entered with several other senior officers, followed shortly by Commander Mitchell. Sarah noted his slightly irritated expression and wondered if he was annoyed by the increased visibility and formal structure of this meeting. Good afternoon, everyone, began. We're here to review the communications security protocols that Petty Officer Martinez has developed for the joint exercise. This has become a model operation that's drawing attention from senior leadership, so I want to ensure we maintain the highest standards. Sarah moved to the front of the room, her presentation materials ready and her manner professionally confident. Despite everything else that was happening in her life, she remained genuinely proud of her technical work and welcomed the opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities. The communications security protocol involves 3 layers of encryption, she began, pointing to diagrams displayed on the wall-mounted screen. Each layer can be independently managed, allowing for flexible response to changing threat conditions. As she explained the technical details, Sarah felt herself settling into the familiar comfort of expertise. This was her domain, where her knowledge and preparation gave her confidence and authority. The assembled officers asked intelligent questions, and she responded with the comprehensive understanding that had earned her reputation for excellence. Captain Santos asked several particularly insightful questions about integration challenges, demonstrating both technical knowledge and appreciation for the complexity of Sarah's work. Her questions helped highlight the sophistication of the protocols, making Sarah's expertise more apparent to the rest of the group. Commander Mitchell's contributions to the discussion were minimal, limited to general comments about the importance of security and timeline adherence. Sarah noticed that he seemed uncomfortable with her prominent role in the briefing, his usual dominance of professional interactions replaced by a more passive position. Excellent work, Martinez, concluded as the briefing ended. I think everyone can see why this protocol is drawing attention from senior leadership. Captain Santos, do you have everything you need for coordination with your team? Absolutely. Petty Officer Martinez has provided comprehensive documentation and demonstrated exceptional attention to detail. I'm confident this integration will proceed smoothly. As personnel began filing out of the conference room, Sarah packed her materials with a sense of satisfaction she hadn't experienced in weeks. The briefing had gone perfectly, showcasing her capabilities in an environment where professional competence was the only measure of value. Martinez, Mitchell's voice cut through her thoughts. A word, please. Sarah's stomach clenched as the familiar pattern reasserted itself. She had hoped that the successful briefing might provide some respite, but Mitchell's tone suggested otherwise. Sir, walk with me. We need to discuss some additional security concerns that have come up. As they left the conference room, Sarah caught Captain Santos watching them with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. The Marine captain's attention felt significant, though Sarah wasn't sure why. Mitchell led her through several corridors to a storage area that housed backup communications equipment. The space was isolated and rarely used during normal operations, providing the privacy that Sarah had learned to dread. Close the door, Mitchell commanded, his tone shifting immediately from professional to something else entirely. Sarah, knowing that resistance would only make the situation worse. She had learned to minimize conflict while preserving some core part of herself that could survive whatever was coming. I wasn't entirely pleased with your performance in that briefing, Mitchell said, moving closer to her in the confined space. Sarah was genuinely confused by the criticism. Sir, the briefing went very well. The protocols were well received, and Captain Santos expressed confidence in the integration. That's exactly the problem. You seemed too comfortable, too confident. You drew attention to yourself, acted like you were the expert instead of recognizing that your role is to support my leadership. The accusation was so unreasonable that Sarah struggled to formulate a response. She had performed exactly as expected, demonstrating the competence that reflected well on the entire unit. I was presenting the technical information as requested, sir. You were showing off, making it appear that you were responsible for the work instead of acknowledging that everything you do is under my guidance and authority. Mitchell's proximity in the small space made it difficult to breathe, and Sarah found herself pressed against the storage shelves with nowhere to retreat. His anger seemed disproportionate to the situation, suggesting that her professional success somehow threatened his position. I apologize if my presentation appeared inappropriate, sir. I was focusing on mission requirements. Mission requirements include proper respect for the chain of command. Maybe you need a reminder of your place in that chain. What followed was 20 minutes that Sarah would later struggle to remember clearly, her mind employing the same defensive dissociation that had become her primary survival mechanism. She focused on a point of light where the storage room's single bulb reflected off a metal shelf, using it as an anchor while everything else happened around her rather than to her. When it was over, Mitchell returned to his professional demeanor with practiced efficiency. I trust you understand the importance of maintaining proper perspective, Martinez. Your technical skills are valuable, but they're only useful when properly channeled through appropriate leadership. Yes, sir, Sarah managed to respond, her voice sounding distant even to herself. Good, we'll have additional briefings over the next few days as the exercise reaches its conclusion. I trust your presentations will demonstrate more appropriate humility. Sarah left the storage area with mechanical movements, her mind still partially disconnected from her body. She had perfected the ability to function normally while processing traumatic experiences, but each incident left her feeling more isolated and desperate for some kind of resolution. As she walked back to her workstation, Sarah encountered Captain Santos in the hallway. The Marine captain's expression immediately shifted to one of concern, her eyes taking in details that Sarah hoped weren't visible. Martinez, are you all right? You look pale. Just tired, ma'am. Long day. Santos studied her with uncomfortably perceptive attention. Perhaps you should take a few minutes to refresh yourself before returning to duty. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. The suggestion was phrased as professional advice, but Sarah detected genuine concern underneath. She nodded gratefully and headed for the nearest restroom, needing a few minutes of privacy to rebuild her emotional defenses. In the mirror, Sarah saw the face she had learned to present to the world, composed, professional, giving no hint of the chaos beneath the surface. She straightened her uniform, checked her appearance, and prepared to return to her duties as if nothing had happened. But as she looked at her reflection, Sarah made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. She would add this incident to her encrypted documentation, but she would also begin reaching out to the potential allies who had offered their support. The time for complete silence was beginning to end, even if she wasn't yet ready for full disclosure. The exercise would conclude in 3 more days, but Sarah no longer planned to endure the situation indefinitely. Change was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. The final day of the joint exercise dawned gray and overcast, matching Sarah's mood as she prepared for what she hoped would be the last day of intensive interaction with Mitchell. Her encrypted documentation had grown to over 40 pages, a detailed chronicle of months of systematic abuse that she still wasn't sure she would ever have the courage to use. The night before, she had reached a breaking point during another late-night meeting that Mitchell had disguised as emergency protocol review. The incident had been worse than usual, his anger over her professional competence manifesting in increasingly aggressive behavior. Sarah had maintained her composure during the encounter, but afterward, alone in her apartment, she had finally allowed herself to cry for the first time in months. Now, as she walked through the base in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. The careful emotional numbness she had cultivated was giving way to a cold anger that felt both dangerous and empowering. She was tired of being afraid, tired of shrinking herself to accommodate someone else's dysfunction, tired of letting her silence enable continued abuse. The communications center buzzed with activity as personnel prepared for the exercise's final phase. Sarah threw herself into the work with renewed focus, finding comfort in the technical challenges that had nothing to do with personal relationships or power dynamics. Her protocols had performed flawlessly throughout the exercise, earning praise from multiple agencies and setting new standards for joint operations. Captain Santos appeared at Sarah's workstation around mid-morning, carrying a folder of evaluation materials and wearing an expression that suggested professional satisfaction. "Martinez, I wanted to personally thank you for your work on this operation. The communications security has been seamless, and my superiors are extremely impressed with the protocols you've developed." Sarah looked up from her console, feeling a genuine smile cross her face for the first time in days. "Thank you, ma'am. It's been a pleasure working with your team." "I mean it. You've demonstrated exceptional capability under pressure, and that doesn't go unnoticed." Santos paused, then continued in a slightly lower voice. "I've also noticed that you've seemed increasingly stressed as the exercise has progressed. I hope the workload hasn't been too overwhelming." The concern in Santos's voice triggered something unexpected in Sarah. Instead of the usual deflection, she found herself considering a different kind of response. "The technical aspects have been manageable," she said carefully. "Some of the interpersonal dynamics have been more challenging." Santos's attention sharpened immediately. Interpersonal dynamics can definitely affect performance and job satisfaction. Sometimes a fresh perspective from outside the immediate work environment can be helpful. Sarah felt her heart racing as she weighed the potential consequences of saying more. Santos had consistently demonstrated professionalism and integrity, and her position outside Sarah's chain of command offered some protection from immediate retaliation. "Ma'am, if someone were experiencing difficulty with their supervisor, what would you recommend as the best course of action?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both women understood. Santos's expression immediately became more serious, her professional instincts clearly recognizing the significance of the inquiry. "That would depend on the nature of the difficulty," Santos replied carefully. "But in general, I believe people deserve to work in an environment where they feel safe and respected. When that's not the case, it's important to seek support from appropriate authorities, even if reporting the problem might create bigger problems for the person making the complaint." Santos was quiet for a long moment, clearly understanding that this was no longer a hypothetical discussion. "Martinez, are you telling me that someone is creating a hostile work environment for you?" Sarah felt tears threatening for the second time in 24 hours, overwhelmed by the simple act of having someone ask the question directly. She had spent so much energy hiding the truth that being invited to acknowledge it felt like a physical relief. She began, then stopped, the habit of silence reasserting itself even as she desperately wanted to speak. "Listen to me," Santos said, her voice filled with quiet intensity. "Whatever is happening, you don't have to handle it alone. There are people who can help, resources available, procedures in place to protect people who report misconduct. But what if the procedures don't work? What if reporting makes everything worse? Then we find other options. We keep escalating until someone listens, until someone acts. But the first step is acknowledging that the situation needs to change." Sarah looked around the communications center, noting the normal activity of personnel going about their duties, unaware of the conversation taking place in their midst. The ordinary nature of their surroundings made the discussion feel both more real and more surreal. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Most important things are complicated. But complexity doesn't mean there's no solution. It just means we have to be smart about finding one." Before Sarah could respond, Lieutenant Commander approached their workstation with several other officers in tow. The group included personnel Sarah didn't recognize, wearing uniforms that suggested they were from higher headquarters levels. "Martinez, Santos, I'd like you to meet Colonel Harrison from Marine Forces Command and Captain David from Naval Communications. They're here to observe the final exercise phase and discuss potential expansion of our protocols to other units." Sarah stood immediately, her professional training taking over despite the emotional turmoil of the past few minutes. The presence of senior officers from outside her immediate command structure created both opportunity and danger. "Ma'am, sir," she responded appropriately. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, a woman in her late 40s whose bearing suggested significant operational experience. "Petty Officer Martinez, I've been following your work on this exercise with great interest. The protocols you've developed represent innovative thinking that we'd like to see implemented more widely." "Thank you, ma'am. I'm pleased that the work has met your expectations." "More than met them. Captain Santos has provided detailed reports on the technical implementation, and Lieutenant Commander has given us comprehensive assessments of your professional performance. We're considering recommending you for advanced training opportunities that could significantly accelerate your career progression." The unexpected praise created a cognitive dissonance that Sarah struggled to process. Here were senior officers discussing her potential advancement, while she was simultaneously dealing with abuse from her immediate supervisor. The contrast highlighted just how disconnected her professional success was from her daily reality. "I'm honored by your confidence in my abilities," she managed to say. "We'd like to schedule a more detailed discussion about these opportunities," Colonel Harrison continued. "Perhaps we could meet this afternoon after the exercise concludes." Sarah glanced at Captain Santos, who nodded encouragingly. "I think that would be very beneficial, Colonel. Martinez has demonstrated exceptional capability throughout this operation." As the senior officers moved on to observe other aspects of the exercise, Sarah felt the weight of possibility settling around her. The career opportunities being discussed represented everything she had originally hoped to achieve in the military, but accepting them would require her to continue operating in an environment where her silence about Mitchell was expected. "That was impressive," Santos observed once they were alone again. "Career opportunities like that don't come along often." "No, they don't," Sarah agreed, but her tone was troubled rather than excited. "You don't seem as enthusiastic as I would expect. Most people would be thrilled by that kind of recognition from senior leadership." Sarah found herself at another crossroads, facing a choice between continued silence and the risk of speaking truth. The morning's conversation with Santos had begun to crack the walls of isolation she had built around herself, and the presence of senior officers from outside her command structure had shown her that the military contained people who valued her professional contributions. "Captain Santos," she said quietly, "what would you do if accepting career advancement meant continuing to work with someone who was making your life miserable?" Santos's expression immediately became more serious. "I would find a way to address the source of the problem before accepting any new responsibilities. Life is too short to spend it being miserable, regardless of career considerations. Even if addressing the problem could destroy everything you've worked for. Martinez, listen to me carefully. If someone is making your life miserable, if they're creating a hostile work environment or worse, then what you've worked for is already being destroyed. The only question is whether you're going to be passive victim or take action to protect yourself. The blunt assessment hit Sarah like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality she had been trying to manage through endurance alone. Santos was right. Her career, her self-respect, her mental health were all being systematically destroyed by her current situation. "I've been documenting everything," she said suddenly, the words emerging before she could stop them. Santos's attention sharpened immediately. Documenting what specifically? Inappropriate behavior, abuse of authority, things that have nothing to do with legitimate military duties. How long has this been going on? Months. It started small, but it's been escalating. The exercise has made it worse because of all the private meetings and extended contact. Santos was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of Sarah's revelation. "Martinez, what you're describing sounds like sexual harassment at minimum, possibly worse. This isn't something you should be handling alone. I don't know who I can trust. He's well-connected, respected by senior leadership. My word against his seems like a losing proposition." That's exactly why documentation is so important. If you have detailed records of incidents, times, places, witnesses, that changes the dynamics significantly. Sarah felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. "You really think the system would work if I reported this?" "I think the system works when people like Colonel Harrison and Captain are involved, when there's proper documentation, when the complaint is taken seriously by people with authority to act. But I also think timing is crucial." "What do you mean?" "You're about to be offered significant career opportunities by senior officers who clearly value your work. That gives you leverage and credibility that you might not have otherwise. It also means that any retaliation becomes much more visible and harder to ignore." As they talked, Sarah felt the pieces of a plan beginning to form in her mind. The senior officer's interest in her work created protection she hadn't had before, and Santos's support provided the outside perspective she needed to see her situation clearly. "What would you do if you were in my position?" she asked. "I would schedule a meeting with Lieutenant Commander today. I would bring my documentation and request a formal investigation. I would also ask for temporary assignment to different duties while the investigation proceeded. And if doesn't take it seriously, then we go to Colonel Harrison, and if necessary, we keep going up the chain until someone acts. But Martinez, you have to understand that once you start this process, there's no going back. It will change everything." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of the decision she was contemplating. But as she looked around the communications center, watching her colleagues go about their duties in an environment where they felt safe and respected, she realized that she was already changed. The only question was whether that change would lead to continued victimization or to reclaiming her life and career. "I need some time to think about this," she said finally. "Of course, but don't take too long. The longer these situations continue, the more damage they do, and the harder they become to address effectively." As the day progressed, Sarah found herself moving through her duties with a new sense of purpose. The exercise concluded successfully, with all objectives met and her protocols performing flawlessly. The praise from senior officers was genuine and significant, creating opportunities that represented everything she had originally hoped to achieve. But underlying the professional success was the growing conviction that she could no longer sacrifice her personal well-being for career advancement. The conversation with Santos had shown her that silence wasn't protecting her, it was enabling her destruction. That evening, as Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing her encrypted documentation, she made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. Tomorrow, she would request a meeting with Lieutenant Commander. She would present her evidence, request an investigation, and finally break the silence that had trapped her for so long. The consequences would be unpredictable and potentially devastating, but continued silence guaranteed continued suffering. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she had some control over her destiny, and she was determined to use it. The morning after the exercise concluded, Sarah arrived at work with a printed copy of her documentation sealed in an envelope and a request for a meeting with Lieutenant Commander submitted through official channels. Her hands had trembled slightly as she typed the meeting request, but her resolve had remained steady. The time for silence was ending. She had spent most of the previous night refining her documentation, organizing incidents chronologically, and including every detail she could remember. The final document was 47 pages long, a comprehensive record of systematic abuse that spanned nearly 8 months. Reading through it in its entirety had been emotionally devastating, but it had also reinforced her conviction that action was necessary. The communications center felt different this morning, somehow lighter despite the overcast sky visible through the windows. The exercise equipment was being dismantled and removed, returning the space to its normal configuration. Sarah found comfort in the return to routine, hoping it signaled the beginning of positive changes in other areas of her life. At 1000 hours, her meeting request was approved for 1400 hours that afternoon. The formal confirmation email from its administrative assistant contained no indication of the meeting's purpose, maintaining the professional discretion that military protocols demanded. Sarah spent the morning completing routine tasks while mentally preparing for the most important conversation of her military career. During lunch, Captain Santos approached her table with purpose evident in her stride. The Marine captain had delayed her departure by 1 day, ostensibly to complete final coordination reports, but Sarah suspected she had stayed to provide support during what she knew would be a crucial period. "How are you feeling about this afternoon?" Santos asked without preamble. "Terrified," Sarah admitted, "but also determined. I can't continue living the way I have been." "That's exactly the right attitude. Fear is normal and appropriate. You're taking a big risk. But determination will carry you through when fear tries to make you back down." Santos sat down across from Sarah, her expression serious but supportive. "I want you to know that I've prepared a statement documenting my observations during the exercise. Nothing specific about incidents I didn't witness directly, but noting changes in your demeanor, signs of stress, and my professional assessment that you appeared to be dealing with significant workplace pressure." The offer of support was unexpected and deeply moving. Sarah felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by the simple act of having someone believe in her enough to provide corroborating evidence. "You didn't have to do that," Sarah managed to say. "Yes, I did. We have an obligation to support each other, especially when someone is facing circumstances like yours. My statement will be available if needed, either for your meeting today or for any subsequent proceedings." What if doesn't believe me? What if she decides the documentation isn't sufficient? Then we escalate. Colonel Harrison is still on base, and she's already expressed significant interest in your career development. If necessary, we involve her directly. But Martinez, I want you to understand that once you start this process, there will be pressure to minimize or dismiss your complaints. You have to be prepared to stand firm. Sarah nodded, understanding the warning. She had researched similar cases and knew that institutional pressure often worked against complainants, even when documentation was thorough and allegations were credible. "I've made peace with the consequences," she said. "I'd rather face retaliation for telling the truth than continue enabling someone who might do this to others." That's the right perspective. What you're doing isn't just about you. It's about protecting other people who might become targets if Mitchell continues unchecked. As they finished lunch, Santos provided Sarah with her contact information and a promise to remain available for consultation or support regardless of how the situation developed. The knowledge that she had an ally outside her immediate command structure provided courage Sarah hadn't known she possessed. At 1350 hours, Sarah stood outside Lieutenant Commander's office with the sealed envelope containing her documentation. Her heart rate was elevated, but her mind was clear and focused. She had rehearsed what she would say, anticipating potential questions and preparing responses that were factual and unemotional. "Enter's voice called in response to her knock. Sarah stepped into the office and assumed a position of attention. "Ma'am, Petty Officer Martinez reporting as requested." "Please sit down, Martinez. Thank you for requesting this meeting. Your message indicated you had important matters to discuss, though you were appropriately discreet about the specifics." Sarah sat carefully, placing the envelope on her lap and taking a deep breath. "Ma'am, I need to report serious misconduct by a superior officer. I have documentation of systematic inappropriate behavior that has been ongoing for approximately 8 months. His expression immediately became more serious, her attention focusing with the intensity that had made her an effective leader. "That's a significant allegation, Martinez. I need you to be very clear about what you're reporting. Sexual harassment and abuse of authority by Commander Mitchell, ma'am. Multiple incidents, escalating severity, extensive pattern of using official duties to create opportunities for inappropriate contact. Sarah watched face carefully, looking for signs of disbelief or dismissal. Instead, she saw controlled anger and professional determination. You mentioned documentation. What type of records are we talking about? Sarah placed the envelope on his desk. Detailed chronological record of incidents, including dates, times, locations, and descriptions of behavior. 47 pages, covering the period from March through present. Opened the envelope and began reading, her expression growing increasingly grim as she absorbed the contents. The silence stretched for nearly 10 minutes as she reviewed the documentation, occasionally making notes or asking brief clarifying questions. Martinez, this is extensive and disturbing. The level of detail suggests you've been very careful about record keeping. I started documenting everything after the first few incidents, ma'am. I realized early that I would need evidence if the situation ever became unbearable. Why didn't you report this sooner? Some of these incidents occurred months ago. Sarah had expected this question and prepared her response carefully. Fear of retaliation, concern about credibility, and hope that the behavior would stop if I managed the situation correctly. I now realize that silence was enabling escalation rather than preventing it. Nodded thoughtfully. That's unfortunately a common pattern in these cases. The power dynamics make reporting feel impossible until the situation becomes desperate. Yes, ma'am. The final decision to report was influenced by recent career opportunities and the realization that I couldn't accept advancement while allowing this behavior to continue. Tell me about your interactions with Captain Santos. Her name appears in several recent entries. Captain Santos observed signs of stress during the exercise and offered support. She encouraged me to report the misconduct and helped me understand that silence wasn't protecting me. Was quiet for several minutes, continuing to review the documentation while making additional notes. Sarah waited in silence, understanding that this pause was crucial to how her complaint would be received. Martinez, I want you to know that I take these allegations very seriously. The behavior you've documented is completely unacceptable and represents serious violations of military law and regulation. Relief flooded through Sarah, followed immediately by apprehension about what would come next. However, continued, proceeding with a formal investigation will be complex and potentially difficult for you personally. Are you prepared for the scrutiny and potential retaliation that might result? Yes, ma'am. Captain Santos helped me understand the risks, and I've decided that continuing to accept this treatment is more damaging than facing the consequences of reporting it. Good, that's the right attitude. Now, here's how we're going to proceed. I'm immediately initiating a formal investigation under Article 138 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You will be temporarily reassigned to duties that minimize contact with Commander Mitchell while the investigation is conducted. Sarah felt another wave of relief, realizing that was taking her complaint seriously and moving quickly to provide protection. I'm also requesting that Colonel Harrison remain on base to provide oversight, given her expressed interest in your professional development and her position outside our immediate chain of command. Having someone of her rank and authority involved will help ensure the investigation is conducted properly. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your taking this seriously. Martinez, I want you to understand that this investigation will be thorough and potentially lengthy. There will be interviews, depositions, review of records, and significant scrutiny of your allegations. Are you prepared for that level of examination? Yes, ma'am. I have complete confidence in the accuracy of my documentation. I also want you to know that retaliation against you for making this complaint would be a separate violation, and I will personally ensure that any such behavior is addressed immediately and severely. As the meeting continued, outlined the investigation process, explained Sarah's rights and protections, and provided resources for counseling and legal support. The professional competence and genuine concern she demonstrated reinforced Sarah's belief that she had made the correct decision. One final question, Martinez. Do you believe there may be other victims of similar behavior by Commander Mitchell? Sarah considered the question carefully. I have no direct knowledge of other incidents, ma'am, but the systematic nature of his behavior suggests this might not be an isolated situation. Understood, that will be part of the investigation as well. When the meeting concluded, Sarah left's office feeling lighter than she had in months. The documentation was in the hands of someone with authority to act, protection measures were being implemented, and the investigation process was beginning. As she walked back to the communications center, Sarah encountered Commander Mitchell in the hallway. His expression was neutral, giving no indication that he was aware of the complaint that had just been filed against him. Sarah maintained professional demeanor as they passed, but for the first time in months, she felt no fear in his presence. The remainder of the afternoon passed quickly as Sarah completed her current assignments and prepared for reassignment to temporary duties. The investigation would take time, and the outcome remained uncertain, but she had taken control of her situation rather than continuing to endure it passively. That evening, Sarah called Captain Santos to provide an update on the meeting with. The Marine captain's response was immediate and supportive, expressing pride in Sarah's courage and confidence in the investigation process. "You did the right thing, Martinez. It took incredible strength to speak up, and it took even more strength to endure what you went through before finding your voice." "I keep thinking about what you said about protecting other potential victims," Sarah replied. "That's what finally convinced me to act. And that's exactly why you're going to come through this stronger than before. When we stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult and dangerous, we discover strengths we didn't know we possessed." 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in a different conference room, facing a panel of senior officers conducting formal proceedings based on her complaint. The investigation had been thorough and professional, revealing a pattern of behavior that extended beyond her own experience. Other victims had come forward, providing additional evidence that corroborated her allegations. Colonel Harrison sat on the investigating panel, her presence ensuring that proper procedures were followed and that the investigation remained focused on facts rather than politics. Her involvement had also protected Sarah from the retaliation she had feared, making it clear that any inappropriate response to the complaint would face severe consequences. As the proceedings concluded, Sarah felt a sense of closure that had seemed impossible months earlier. The investigation had vindicated her decision to speak up, resulting in accountability for misconduct and changes in procedures designed to prevent similar situations. The young woman who had once remained silent in the face of abuse had found her voice and used it to protect herself and others. The journey had been difficult and sometimes frightening, but it had led to justice and the opportunity for a career built on merit rather than exploitation. Standing in that conference room, Sarah understood that she had not only survived her ordeal, but emerged from it stronger and more determined than before. The silence that had once trapped her had been replaced by the confidence to speak truth, regardless of the consequences.